At this point, my design is done, my glow is built, but before we move on to the animation, I want to add some little details that'll push this design to be a little bit more unique. The first detail I want to add is probably the most obvious. When you think of neon signs, most of the time you think of a flicker. That'll help bring this design to life before we even do any animation. So to add a flicker, I'm going to go back into my neon source, and I'll make a new adjustment layer by going to Layer, New, Adjustment Layer. Then I'll make sure it's at the top of my layer stack, and I'll come over to the Effects and Presets and type in Exposure. We'll add the exposure to the adjustment layer and rename this layer Flicker. Now we're going to add some expressions to this effect. So I'll press E to show the effects, twirl down Exposure, twirl down Master, and we'll add an expression to the exposure value. I'll do this by holding down Option or Alt on a PC and clicking on the stopwatch. This will allow us to type in an expression, and I'll type wiggle, parentheses, 3, comma, 10, parentheses, and then I'll click off. Now our work disappeared. Why is that? It's because this expression is saying randomize this value 3 times per second by a value of 10. If I ram preview the first second of this, you can see what's happening. The exposure is being randomized 3 times in this second by a value of 10. Now a value of 10 is huge for the exposure property. So what I need to do is knock that down to something like 1. So let me adjust this expression. And now you can see that flicker is much more subtle. But it's happening much slower than I want it to. So I'm going to increase the first value, which is the number of times this property is adjusted per second, from 3 to 15. Now that flicker is much more the speed that I'm looking for, but I think the value it's being adjusted by is too much. So I'm going to change this from 1 to 0.5 and see what that does. That's better, but I think it's probably still a little too dramatic. So I'm going to drop that down to 0.25. It might even be a little hard for you to see at this point, but we want this effect to be really subtle, and once we come back into our main comp, it'll be much more apparent. So let's go back into that comp and preview what it looks like in here. Now you can see that this is taking much longer to process, and that's because it has to render every single one of these glow layers on top of each other for every frame, because that exposure value in the flicker adjustment layer is changing everything on every frame. So it'll take a little bit longer to preview, but the end result should look pretty good. So there you go, we've got a flickering sign. It still might be a little bit more than I need, but that's a decision you can make. Even now I can tell that this wide glow is a little too intense, so I'm going to knock that down to 25% opacity. And I think that's working a little bit better. Alright, now that we've got our flicker, let's add some texture by using grain. I'll make a new adjustment layer by going to Layer, New, Adjustment Layer, and renaming this Grain. Now one way to do this is by adding noise, which is 32-bit compatible. So I'll double click on that, and then increase the noise until it's about the size that I want it to look. If I zoom in here, you can see how that's affecting the design. I'll turn it on and off. And it just adds some texture to make the design look a little bit more organic. I could turn off the color part of the noise so it's not affecting any of the colors. And I can increase the noise. But that's about all I can do with this effect. There's nothing wrong with this noise filter, but there's a great little preset from videocopilot.net called Fast Film Grain. And I'll put a link to download this free preset in the notes of this video. So I'll delete the noise that I just added and then double click on Fast Film Grain. Now by default this is what the grain looks like, so I need to change the blending mode from normal to overlay. Now that's blending the grain on top of the design. Now any of the effects from this preset that start with FX need to stay the way they are, so you can ignore them. So I'll just collapse any of the effects that have FX in front of it, and we're left with these controls. And this is using the noise effect just like before. Probably turn that down just a little bit. And then there's a blur amount, which controls how soft the grain is. So I'll probably turn that down to 0.15. So it's a little bit more gritty. And all these effects working together produce a more natural looking film grain. So I'm pretty happy with the way that looks. Now if we preview this, you can see that there's texture on every frame. It might be a little bit hard to view through this recording, but if you take a look at my project page, you'll see that it's there. Now if I back out, because my background is a gradient, I already have a natural vignette happening. So it's darker around the outside than it is on the inside. But just so I can show you how to make a vignette, I'm going to go ahead and set the background to be a solid color. I'll make it that dark purpley blue again. Now I'll make another adjustment layer. Layer, new adjustment layer. And at the top I'll rename this Vignette. Then I will add an exposure. Turn down the exposure. Maybe decrease the gamma. And I'll move this layer below the grain so that the grain is affecting everything. And because this vignette is affecting the entire design, I need to add a mask so that it's only affecting the outside. So I'll come up to my mask tools and go to the ellipse tool, then click in the center of the comp and drag. Then I will hold Shift to make it a perfect circle, and Command or Control on a PC to scale it from the center. And I'll make it about this size. And on the vignette layer, you can see that mask 1 has already opened up. I'll change Add to Subtract so that it inverts the mask. Then I'll press F on the keyboard to bring up the mask feather, and then crank this up to make the mask much softer. Then I'll click on this little icon to turn off the visibility of the mask. And then I'll collapse this mask and open it up so I can see all of the controls, and change the mask expansion to push the adjustment out further to the corners of the comp. And that's how you can make a vignette. From here, you can adjust the exposure to your taste. I'll go ahead and lock these two layers so I don't accidentally adjust them. Right now, all of my lights are turned on, but once we get to the animation, the lights are going to be turning on and off. If I were to go into my source comp, and then turn off a couple of the layers, then come back into my main comp, those bulbs completely disappear. I don't want them to disappear though, I want it to look like there's a neon bulb there that's just not being illuminated. So what I need to do is duplicate my source layer, so I'll come down to it and press Command D or Control D on a PC, and rename this Bulb. I'll move it below the source, and I'm going to solo it and the background layers. Now I want to make it look like these bulbs are turned off. So I'll add an exposure effect to this layer. I'll turn the exposure way down, and then I'll turn the gamma up, which will kind of desaturate the layer. Keep turning that down until right about there. See, that's where we start to lose all of the illumination from the bulb. It's still a little bit saturated, so I'm going to increase the gamma just a bit, and I think that looks pretty good. Now this might be extremely difficult for you to see, so I'm actually going to add a new solid layer that's just a gray color so we can see what's happening. If I turn this exposure back off, you see that we get our color back. So that's what the exposure adjustment is doing. I'm going to zoom in here even more, and what I want to do is actually increase the thickness of these lines just a little bit. But I can't do it by going to the source and increasing the size of the stroke, because that will affect all of the glow layers as well. Instead, I'm going to come up to my effects and type in Choke. And then I'm going to add the effect Simple Choker. And if I bring it to a negative value, it actually gets a little bit thicker. Now, I don't want to do this by much. Just about there is probably fine. It makes the bulbs just a little bit thicker, which will allow us to add some depth to it. On the bulb layer, go to Layer Styles, and come down to Bevel and Emboss. And you can see that that added some shading to my design. Now at its default, it's not set up the way that I want it. So I need to come down to my Layer Styles, twirl down Bevel and Emboss, and the first thing I want to do is change the angle. Right now the light is coming from the left a bit, but I want it to come from straight up and down. So I'll change the angle value to 90 degrees. Now that highlight is directly on top of our design. Then we can change the altitude to make it appear as if the light source is further away from the bulbs. Then I'm going to turn the size down just a little bit. And to adjust it by a small amount, I'm holding down Command or Control on a PC while clicking and dragging. Then I'll scroll down a little bit more and turn the highlight opacity down. Because I don't want this to be a very dramatic effect. I want it to be very subtle to add just a little bit of depth for when the lights are off. But I don't want it to be distracting from the rest of the design. I think the shadow's looking pretty good. So if I turn this off and back on, you can see that we're pretty much just adding a highlight. But that's exactly what I wanted. So I'll zoom back out, collapse this layer, delete that gray solid, and now you can see what that's doing. Looking at this with the dark background, I think that highlight is still a little bit too strong. So I'm going to go back into the bulb, scroll down to the highlight opacity, and turn it down even further. There we go. So if I turn this on and off, you can see it's very subtle, but it adds a lot of depth. Now another thing I could do is actually add a drop shadow to this bulb layer. So I'll type in drop shadow, change the direction from 135 to 180 so it's coming directly down. And if I come over to this little control on the end here, I can temporarily increase the exposure of the viewer without affecting anything in the source. All I have to do is click this button to turn it off or back on. So that's very useful for when you need to see things better. So the shadow is a little bit too sharp. I want to increase the softness just a little bit. Turn the opacity way down because I want this effect to be just as subtle. Then I'll turn the distance down to maybe 3. Turning that off and on, you can see what that looks like. Reset the exposure. I think that looks pretty good. I can unsolo these 2 layers. And obviously now we don't see the bulb because all the lights are turned on. But once we get into animation, that layer is going to be very helpful to sell this effect. One other important thing to take note of is that I've been working at full resolution this whole time, and generally working in pretty close. That's because the way that all this light is mixing looks differently at different resolutions. If you're rendering at full resolution, you'll see an exact representation of how this is going to export. But if you're working at half, you can see that light is mixing a little bit differently, the grain looks much bigger, and if you were to back this out to quarter, it doesn't even look like the same glow. So I highly recommend that you work at full resolution, because even though it takes longer to preview, you're not really going to be able to see an exact representation of the final at any other resolution. And remember to zoom into 100% as well, because sometimes looking at something from further away also doesn't give you a very good representation of what it will look like in the end. So at this point you can design your own glow. Experiment with different effects, play around with stuff, and just have some fun building your own custom neon sign glow. Post some examples of what you came up with on your project page, then move on to the next unit where we'll start animating the design.